A lot of people didn't know the difference between coral and a shell.
You can't protect something you don't see.
We'll dive a little more into it, pun intended.
In Sri Lanka, we have about 208 coral species.
Is it okay to pick up a coral that you see washed up?
They don't really understand how long of an evolutionary mechanism that they have lasted.
Professor, how long does it take to get a reef to grow back?
The nature has been making 10 million different species to do 10 million different jobs in this the cycle of nature. And we are just a single species. And the nature doesn't need us.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another conversation on conservation. And something very, very precious to us is what we're going to be talking about: the ocean around us and the corals and the life that lives beneath it. Something that is very important, particularly to us Sri Lankans. And I've got two very interesting people who've dedicated a lot of their life to it joining me today. Welcome, Professor Perera and Aindri. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
We're going to jump straight into it with Aindri. Aindri, what brought you into this life where you're pretty much dedicating your whole life to the ocean and what lies beneath?
I started diving at a very young age. So I was 17 when I first discovered this thing called diving. I was snorkeling before and I was very interested in the sea and all its creatures. And my snorkel guide, actually, he mentioned how there's this thing called diving and how I can go deeper to about 18 meters and see what's beneath our ocean. And I was like, okay, I'm really interested in doing this. And then he was like, yeah, you should definitely do it because you're very comfortable in the water. And yeah, and it started from there. And now I'm a dive master, which means I can take people out diving and I can teach them diving as well.
Fantastic. Now, we live on an island. We're surrounded by the ocean. We've got this blue economy that really supports our island as well. It has an impact on our biodiversity. It has an impact on weather, all that. But we as Sri Lankans seem to have very little knowledge about the ocean and what lies beneath. I mean, 11 years I studied in the government sector school as well. I was thinking about it this morning and I learned very little about the ocean. And as someone who's now gone and studied up to a point of a degree, why do you think there's this gap?
Yeah, I have this conversation with a lot of people. So I always talk about how we're surrounded by the ocean and we're an island and people need to be more inclined to the sea. And it should be like natural where people would just go out to sea because the sea is so close to you and in such close proximity. But I feel like a reason that people are scared of the ocean is because of the tsunami that happened in 2004 and all these natural disasters that has affected us throughout generations, and that has affected people being like fearing the ocean kind of thing. But I think it's changing because there are so much of awareness now and so many people talking about the ocean, and there are so many NGOs doing amazing work and really good projects for the ocean, and people I think understand how important it is.
Great. So all about the reef, more corals, is it? Tell us all about the reef. What is it all about?
Well, I actually just started it as a pet project. So it was marine. I would like to call it a marine conservation organization where we educate the public about marine education and marine conservation. And so we have done a few projects like underwater cleanups and coral restoration projects in the Maldives. And also I do like workshops and education related, do talks and things like that.
Great. We'll dive a little more into it, pun intended. Before that, Professor Perera, can you tell us a bit about the organizations you're affiliated with and the work you are doing around that?
Yeah, so thanks again for having me, and it's great to be part of this conversation for conservation, because it's really interesting and important to understand that how little we are talking about conservation. There are so many conversations, but little on conservation. I'm a professor in Sabaragama University, but at the same time, I'm on leave from the university working as the program coordinator for IUCN in Sri Lanka. IUCN is the International Union for Conservation of Nature, an intergovernmental organization who is working on knowledge-based, evidence-based conservation throughout the world. And we have been one of the oldest organizations, a very unique union of membership who are working on conservation throughout the world. And at the same time, I'm also representing the Biodiversity Sri Lanka as a director here, because Biodiversity Sri Lanka was born with IUCN and the Chamber of Commerce and a few other individuals and organizations putting together a consortium of private sector organizations to work or to contribute towards conservation in Sri Lanka. So I'm wearing two hats here from IUCN and the Biodiversity Sri Lanka. And at the same time, there is this very interesting larger project that we have secured for Sri Lanka called Sri Lanka Coral Reef Initiative, which is going to be more or less the blueprint of marine conservation in Sri Lanka, focusing on coral reefs. So it's called Sri Lanka Coral Reef Initiative, funded by the Global Fund for Coral Reefs. So Sri Lanka being one of the global hotspots for coral reefs and coral diversity and conservation, we have been fortunate to secure this Sri Lanka Coral Reef Initiative from the GFCR during the second round of their funding. So the GFCR is a new multilateral donor for conservation of marine sector. So IUCN Sri Lanka is the convening agent for the Sri Lanka Coral Reef Initiative. So I would say that's how I fit in here.
Great. Just tell us now, again, in from an educational standpoint, just for the everyday man and woman of Sri Lanka, why are coral reefs so important to us?
Yeah, it's really important in terms of two aspects. But most of the time, the first thing that comes to one's mind when we talk about coral reefs is the beauty, the serene environment that is underwater. But the more or less the ecological importance and the scenic importance. But behind that, there's a huge economic importance and an importance for the livelihoods of the people when it comes to coral reefs as well as the associated marine habitats. Now, for example, so I'm not a marine biologist by training. I'm an ecologist and a conservation biogeographer. But being so, for me and for many of the folks, the rainforest would be more closer to their hearts than the coral reefs, because coral reefs, as Aindri was saying, the marine sector has been a little far from our thinking. So we mostly know that the rainforests are doing so many services for us, not only the goods, but many services being provided, where we won't be able to live our lives the way we are living if not for the rainforests simply. But the rainforests are covering very little land cover when we take the whole world. Similarly, the coral reefs are considered the rainforests under the ocean, so under the water, where it's only covering about 1% of the entire ocean. However, 25% of the species that are living in the ocean that we have known already, we have described already, are living in coral reefs or depending on coral reefs for their lives. 70% of the fishery production globally will vanish if the coral reefs are not there, because the nurseries and the breeding grounds for all those, even the deep sea fishery, is maintained by these coastal habitats such as coral reefs, seagrass beds and mangroves, especially the reefs. So that's one aspect, so fishery aspects. Then in addition to that, there are a lot of other opportunities like sustainable tourism opportunities, aquaculture opportunities, and many other livelihood opportunities for people who are living with this enormous resource. But we don't really understand the value of this resource economically, and that is exactly why we have been keeping our coastal communities as poor. It should not be the case.
Absolutely. And going back to you, just taking from that, the fact that a lot of us, even living on island, don't understand exactly what these coral reefs do for us and the value of it. And like Professor was saying, rainforest, we kind of understand it because we see it, and you at least see a tree or two and you know what it's all about. Whereas I suppose with the ocean, everything lies beneath, and maybe the lack of access to it is what's keeping that gap between the everyday person and the ocean. And you said how diving opened you up to it. So from a background like that, what are you doing to help educate the younger generation to take this out there to the everyday person? And what are the little things that, while Professor is working with the science and they're working with corporates and so on, a lot of what you're doing with your organization is working with everyday people, young people. Can you just tell us more about that and what the everyday person can do towards helping sustain these reefs?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, it is important that the younger generation understands the importance of coral reefs. And as Professor mentioned as well, so it's known to be that there is 1% of corals in the world, and they are known to be the rainforests of the sea. And they have so much of benefits, and it has so much of importance because they provide oxygen. They even create habitats for so many species. So if I'm not mistaken, in Sri Lanka, we have about 208 coral species, and we have about 1,300 fish species. And all of these species, even marine mammals to mollusks to so many sea creatures, depend on coral reefs and the colony that it creates. So it is important for people to understand this and to know the importance of coral reefs. And from our perspective, what we do is to make them understand that you don't have to be a scientist or a researcher to save the ocean or protect the ocean. As a citizen, there are so many things that you can do to protect the ocean. So that's what we...
Could you share some of that? Like as an everyday person, what can we do to help save the ocean?
As a start, you could understand the kind of pollutants that go into the sea and be a bit more aware of what you purchase, for example, plastic, and be more sustainable and live a more sustainable life. That would be the first and most easiest thing to do. I mean, it's not as easy as what people think, but I mean, a small change is large. It could be a big change for the world. That is one thing, and additionally, you could understand. So, for example, we did this coral restoration project in the Maldives, where we allowed guests to get involved in planting corals. And that really helped them understand the importance of corals. And when they saw the growth of these corals, they really understood how, what kind of impact they had done as well, and they appreciated it more. So I think things like that and cleanups are also a really good opportunity for people to understand the kind of plastic that comes to our coast through the ocean. So there are a lot of things that people can do, and I think these are a few things that...
So I'm gonna ask you questions, pretty much corals for dummies questions, all right? So I'll go for short answers from you. Are corals alive?
Yes.
So if you were to compare corals to something we can see on land, you would compare it to what?
It's a basic... Coral is an animal.
Okay, so yeah. Coral is an animal, and
it's a marine invertebrate.
When we see coral washed up ashore, it's generally white or very pale in color. And when you see it in all the ocean videos, photography, it's got color. Why is that?
So the reason that you see a white coral is because it's either bleached or dead. So if a coral is bleached, that doesn't mean it's completely dead. There is a way that this coral can recover from it. But if you see it washed up ashore, that means it's obviously dead. But the reason is because corals are very sensitive to ocean temperatures. They're a lot like us. They're very sensitive, and they need self-care too. So, for example, if they are stressed by something, if it's the temperature of the ocean and they're stressed by it, they need to recover from it as well.
Is it okay to pick up a coral that you see washed up ashore?
It is okay, but if more people do it, I feel like it's going to have a larger impact on the ocean. Corals are made out of calcium carbonate, and the more it degrades, it turns into sand. So it helps with soil erosion. So it is okay to pick up one or two corals that are dead, but I don't think if everyone goes to pick it up, it is going to cause a huge impact.
Professor, would you add to that, please?
Yeah, I mean, if you find a coral that's washed ashore, that means it's dead. So it's not really a issue of picking it and having it for some educational purposes. But if it is for decorative purposes or for ornamental purposes, rather not, because it's a part of the environment again. So, but we have to understand it's not like picking a live orchid from a rainforest. It's a dead component of the system. So rather it decays into the system rather than staying inside a house.
So blasting coral is another problem we're having, right? So this is something we tackled actually some time ago with a project we did with Ocean Conservation, where we found that the fisher folk during off-season were blasting corals as a means of creating revenue. And we managed to do an aloe vera project around it and got them to transfer their attentions there and thereby save the corals. So this blasting coral is a problem. So what can we do to dissuade that, and why is that such a big problem?
Yeah, it's really, I would say, the most important point to tackle in conservation of corals in Sri Lanka. Because now, one of the very reasons why we find dead coral pieces on the shoreline is because of blasting, which we don't see, but it happens on a regular basis in many places in Sri Lanka. Just for catching fish, these fishermen doesn't understand how long it takes for the reef to be built up to the level that it is. Tens of thousands, or if not hundreds of thousands of years, building up of a reef is gathering fish together in these sites. And they use that as a site where they can catch a lot of fish. But it's difficult to catch fish on the reef in most cases because you can't use nets. Nets get entangled in the reefs, and there are many other issues. So for a quick return, what they do is they just blast the entire system so that the fish will die and they will float on so that they can collect them. And they don't really understand how long of an evolutionary mechanism that they have blasted and how long it takes for it to recreate and bring the fish back to that particular station. So it's a huge disaster, and it's completely something that we need to stop. So stopping behaviors of few fishermen like this. It's not all the fishermen. There are many people that we have been working with. There are not these big reef areas, but there are smaller satellite reef areas which are close to a shore. And there are communities who are living with these reefs. They want their reefs to be saved because they know how their livelihoods are dependent on those reefs. So they will do a lot of things to get these reefs protected from these illegal fishermen. So it's a few people who does it. So one thing is that we need to enforce the law. So when it comes to dynamite fishing or blast fishing, number one is law enforcement. But in addition to that, we need a very organized campaign of making people aware. So that has to support while the law is enforced.
Professor, you've also been instrumental through your organizations on bringing a lot of corporates together in this route to ocean conservation. Can you give us more information on that?
Yeah, now when it comes to conservation, when it comes to IUCN, earlier IUCN has been a very much a scientific and knowledge-based organization that works with scientists and bringing tools and applications for conservation. However, with the new millennia, IUCN has understood that it is not only the way of making the world better or making conservation a much more accepted way to go. We need to get the corporates involved. So the corporate involvement, getting the private sector into conservation is something that IUCN globally has started looking into after, I would say, 2000 in the new millennia. At the same time, when we come to Sri Lanka, the Sri Lanka Country Office of IUCN has been working with the Biodiversity Sri Lanka. And Biodiversity Sri Lanka has been instrumental in bringing consortiums of private sector together. Initially, the CSR funds from number of private organizations putting together into one pot would make something different. So that is really interesting project that I would like to call again rainforests, because BSL has been working on rainforest conservation, actually rainforest restoration in Kannelia. I think getting nearly 12 private companies together to fund a single project, because although destruction is easy, restoration is costly. So especially the rainforest restoration, coral restoration, these are costly businesses. They need finances. So finances for rainforest restoration in Kanneliya has been secured through BSL by a consortium of private sector companies, and it can easily be used as a blueprint for rainforest restoration in Sri Lanka. It's a prototype project, and even the specialists who are working on rainforest didn't believe that the rainforest can be restored even if you spend a lot of money, because there are many aspects of environmental conditions that you need to restore for the forest to come back. It's the same when it comes to the coral reefs. She was talking about these projects. They need not only the coral propagules being placed in these structures, but also there are a lot more environmental conditions that we need to make sure that the proper health is there in the ocean. Otherwise, they will not restore. So BSL has been able to do that, getting the corporates and the private sector into the conservation field in Sri Lanka. And more we talk about the economic benefits of conservation. Now, when it comes to the oceans and the coral reef, we are talking about the blue economy. There are so much of economic benefits and revenue that we can generate through conservation itself. One avenue is tourism. It is not only tourism. There are many other ways. And if we really account for the income or the revenue that can be generated through conservation of natural resources while they provide these ecosystem services, we call, then it is not that difficult to bring the private sector together into these projects. And that's what Biodiversity Sri Lanka has been doing, and quite successfully.
Two questions together. Yeah. One is Spa Ceylon's come on board with BSL, firstly to draw awareness through the many things Spa Ceylon's doing out there, through packaging, through imagery, through an immersive experience, and we're taking it all around Sri Lanka. We're taking it also to the world to draw attention towards it. Apart from that, we are partnering with BSL to create a difference and towards conservation. Can you expand on that partnership and where those funds will be used?
Yeah, surely. So when it comes to this particular initiative, it is called Life for Our Coral Reefs. So the BSL was doing this rainforest conservation as Life for Our Rainforest.
Right.
So similar program is now being initiated for the coral reef conservation. I would also like to bring in the Sri Lanka Coral Reef Initiative, which I told you about earlier, into this picture, because the IUCN Sri Lanka is working as the convening agent for this larger project on conserving coral reefs in Sri Lanka through a paradigm shift. Because there are a number of new aspects that we are bringing into coral conservation through the Sri Lanka Coral Reef Initiative. One is bringing in co-management, so managing the reefs, combining or bringing in, integrating all the agencies that are working on the coast conservation. We have the Coast Conservation Department, Wildlife Department, Department of Fisheries, NGOs, private sector, and all sorts of stakeholders. So we are bringing in co-management of not only the reef, but also the influence zone of the reef. So we are going for seascape management than coral reef conservation. So using co-management for seascape conservation, and also bringing in blue economy benefits for revenue generation in these larger seascapes. So the communities that are living with the reefs can be made more economically sustainable. So the resilience is to be built also for the reefs as well as for the coastal communities. So with this larger project, we have identified 3 priority seascapes in Sri Lanka: the Bar Reef Seascape, Pigeon Island Seascape, and the Kayan Kearney Seascape in Batticaloa. Biodiversity Sri Lanka particularly wanted to bring in the private sector involvement into the Kayan Kearney Seascape under the SLCRI through the Life for Our Coral Reefs initiative. And there we are really happy to see Spa Ceylon joining us. And it's really interesting that you have this passion of bringing in the beauty and the interesting serene experience of coral reef into your business. So it's really mingling with each other nicely. And at the same time, you are supporting a global cause, a good cause, where we are trying to conserve some of the best reefs in Sri Lanka. And these reefs are selected because they are climate refugee reefs. because there has been number of natural bleaching events for coral reefs in the world, again caused by human activities. It is the global warming that is one cause, but in addition to that, there are some other causes like El Niños that can be linked to human activities, but at the same time, they're natural as well. So during the El Niños in 1998, 2016, 2019, and even in 2024, there has been some bleaching events in the world, but some of these reefs in Sri Lanka has been very good in surviving under the bleaching conditions. So they are identified as resilient reefs. So the Spa Ceylon and the other private sector companies are supporting the resilient reefs to be conserved for the future. So those are going to be the best reefs that will face the climate change crisis that is yet to come.
Professor, how long does it take to get a reef to grow back? I mean, can we put a timeline on it? Is there some sort of estimate?
I don't think we can put on a timeline, but it is a long time. I mean, there are some species, as I told you, I'm not a marine specialist, but there are some species like the staghorn corals, acrophoras, that are growing fast. They can grow about 1 centimeter per year or so.
Yeah.
But there are other corals like the brain corals and a few other types of corals which takes tens or hundreds of years for them to grow into a reef. And at the same time, as I told you, corals are different species of invertebrates, as she told, and they are making these calcium carbonate, I would say, homes for them to stay, and that's how the reef is built up. But for the reef to build up, there are a number of environmental conditions that needs to be conducive. So even the acrophoras under unfavorable conditions will not grow fast.
Right.
So again, if we add a lot of pollutants to the environment, or if we make the oceans to get more warmer, they may not grow up.
Right. Aindri, as an avid diver, you said diving is what opened you up to what the ocean has to offer, and that got you more conscious about conservation and so on as well. Is there a framework to get more people into diving? What are the options if someone wants to start diving? What are the different types of diving available, so on and so forth?
There's different courses that you can do and the ways you can become a diver. So the first dive course that I could recommend to anyone would be the Discovery diving course, where we basically teach you the basics of diving, and then we take you to about 7 to 8 meters for you to get an idea as to whether you like it and if you really want to do the course kind of thing. So after that, you can do the open water course, where you can go to about 18 meters, and it is a license that you can dive around the world. And then so on and forth, you go on. If you want to go to about 30 meters, there is this advanced diving course. And there are different diving associations as well, but PADI is the most recognized association. And I think young people should definitely try to get into diving, because you can't protect something you don't see. And it's important for them to understand the destruction that it causes. So just like what Professor mentioned, like all these bleach corals, you can see it on a video and you see the difference. But when you actually get into the water, you see it and you feel it. Like you see the ocean temperatures reducing. You see the bleached corals and it affects you more, and it really helps you understand how much it needs to be saved. So I think more people should get into diving.
Snorkeling, for instance, I mean, at a school level, can't we get people involved in snorkeling? Because that's a great starting point. We don't see schools involved with the ocean at all. Is it because they deem it to be too dangerous, or what do you think is going on there?
It's funny how you mentioned this, because at our uni, they had this course where they taught us swimming and life saving. That was the first time I saw a uni actually putting it on a course and making people understand how, because, for example, we were doing a course on ocean science, and you can't, even though you're a researcher or a scientist, if you don't see it, you won't be able to understand. There's only so much that you can understand. So it is important that schools do put this, at least make swimming an important class that children should do so that they are more confident in the water, and then they would eventually want to swim and want to snorkel.
So I totally agree, 100%. I mean, if we can make all the school children to have a single dive in their school life, they will start loving the ocean. I mean, you need to have that experience. Diving in a healthy reef like what we can find in Pigeon Island in Trincomalee or Kayankani in Batticaloa. I mean, if you just have a good snorkel for 1 hour, just for the entire life, that would be enough for you to love the ocean, not only the coral reefs, the entire ocean. I mean, it's a one of a kind experience that everyone should have. And if we can inculcate this in at least in the coastal schools, I think, because even there are many people, many students in the national education system who are in the coastal areas who have never ever seen a reef alive. So that's something that we can bring into the education in Sri Lanka.
Absolutely. I mean, we were having conversations and a lot of people didn't know the difference between coral and a shell. A lot of people didn't understand that corals were alive. And there were people who didn't understand that the corals had wash ashore and are white out, actually bleached corals, although they had seen videos and so on and so forth. So this is one of the reasons we wanted to do that immersive experience as well, because we wanted people to have, without actually getting in the ocean, as a precursor to that, to actually feel like you are in the ocean and experience the beauty and the serenity and the life of it. Because understanding that there is life, understanding these corals are alive, is going to change completely the way we think about it. Because there is so much detachment when you pick up a coral on the sand, because it doesn't feel alive. But when you see it in that environment, that's when things change. And I think that's the conversation we've been having. We need to get more people exposed to that and see the beauty, see the life, and connect with it. And that changes perspective completely, much like we have for animals and forests and so on. So thank you both for being with us. It's been an amazing and enlightening conversation. Just before we go, I'll ask you for some parting words. So I'll start with you, Professor.
Thanks, Shalin. Thanks a lot for having us for this conversation for conservation, because it is important that we understand conservation is not something that we are doing for our love for nature or for kindness, or, I mean, it's not something selfless. Conservation has to be done for nothing else but for us, because this is a message that we need to understand very clearly, that we have been on this very earth only for about 200,000 years maximum. From our ancestral species, it is only about 300,000 years. But the world has been evolving for 4.6 billion years. And the nature has been making 10 million different species to do 10 million different jobs in the cycle of nature. And we are just a single species. And the nature doesn't need us. I mean, human extinction wouldn't be a problem for the Mother Earth. But we need nature for our survival, for our future generations. We have now come into a number of global agreements, conventions, and we now believe we need to protect at least 30% of land, 30% of fresh water, and the 30% of marine life, just to ensure our future survival. But when it comes to this, we are far, far behind when it comes to marine conservation. So protecting 30% of oceans as it is for future, we have not even thought about it. So we have to get together for marine conservation in the same way that we are working for the terrestrial conservation. So thank you so much, and please do more conversations on conservation, that we can bring more people to be aware of what we are doing on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you, Professor. Very, very powerful words. Thank you. Aindri?
Yeah, firstly, I'd like to thank you all for bringing me here. It was a really good opportunity for me to also talk about what we do. And I am very appreciative of the work that you all are doing as well for conservation. I think it's amazing that companies find it useful and beneficial to work on marine conservation and biodiversity and basically saving the environment with the work that you all do. Parting words would be, you don't have to be a scientist or researcher to save the ocean. And just like how you adventure out on land, I think you should adventure out in the ocean as well.
On that, Aindri, are you taking me diving? There we go. We've heard it here. And it's on. We're going to share the footage with you guys as well. Thank you both for being with us. Thank you for joining us for another conversation on conservation. Amazing conversation. We learned a lot. Spa Ceylon has been committed to conservation, particularly around this beautiful island of ours, because as the professor rightly pointed it out, nature does not need us, but we need nature. And if we do not work on preserving nature while we are around, we will go, nature will continue, evolve and regenerate itself, but we need to really work for it. We need to do it for us. We need to do it for our future generations. We need to do it for the future of our country and the world. And this is why Spa Ceylon is so committed to conservation across various forms, from the ocean to our rainforest, to our fruiting plants, to our butterflies, our pollinators and animal life as well, because we want to bring a very different aspect of conservation to it, using our design, using the different channels we have, using our reach across the world, across every country we're at, to bring attention to you about the need for conservation and how you can be a part of it, and how you can contribute to it, and working with people like this to make it happen. So thank you for joining Spa Ceylon and its conservation efforts. Thank you for joining us to watch these conversations, and please do spread the word, please do share, and have a great day.